never imagined my life would take this turn. I was called to investigate the disappearance of 4 friends in a remote town. The kind of case that seemed simple at first but ended up taking me to a place. A place where reality distorts and fear takes over. The kind of place I only imagined in nightmares. The friend's car was found on the road, abandoned, surrounded by thick fog. There were no signs of a struggle, nor any clues that anything had happened there. The place was empty. The deserted road, the cutting silence. Only the sound of the wind breaking the stillness. It was as if the people had simply disappeared into thin air. The local authorities had no answers. And, as the weeks went by, the trail started to grow cold. No witnesses, no sounds, no traces. That's when I began digging deeper. I found something I couldn't ignore. The nearby village had an old story. A story no one wanted to talk about, but the elders still whispered. Decades ago, there was a cult that disappeared without a trace, after a sacrifice that repeated itself every 30 years. They believed the ritual would ensure the prosperity of the land and keep the town safe from destruction. No one knew if it was real or just superstition. But as the investigation deepened, I began finding connections that couldn't be ignored. The first messages came as a simple warning, anonymous with no sender. Don't go any further. They are waiting. I thought it was someone playing a prank, until more messages began to appear, clearer and more threatening. The fog will swallow you too. The phone rang one night. It was a low voice, almost a whisper. You're getting too close. I was in my car, still some distance from the village, but I could already feel something heavy in the air. Something was watching me. Something wanted me there. With every kilometer I advanced, the fog seemed to intensify, closing in around me. I felt as if I was being followed, watched. When I arrived at the village, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. The place was deserted. The houses with closed windows looked abandoned, but I knew someone was there. Something was there. I heard whispers in the shadows, sounds that seemed to come from the houses and the trees around me. But there was no one. The fog was thick, almost tangible, and when I entered the old chapel that had served as the cult center, I felt like I was stepping into something more than just a missing person story. The air was heavy, filled with a sinister energy, and it was there that I found what I was looking for. On the chapel walls, ancient marks, symbols I had never seen before, but were clearly connected to the ritual. The sacrifice. They had done it, and now they needed more victims. I was one of them. Something was pulling me into that place. The fog was not natural. It was alive. The messages, the warnings, it all made sense now. The cult had never disappeared. They had left a legacy of terror passed down from generation to generation. And I was next on the list. What happened next is hard to explain. I don't know if it was exhaustion, fear, or if I was being manipulated by something beyond human understanding. When I tried to leave the chapel, I found a figure standing before me, surrounded by the fog. Its eyes were empty, lifeless, but I knew it saw me. I knew it was there, waiting for me to become part of the ritual. The last thing I remember is the sound of the fog, whispering my name, as everything around me darkened. I don't know how I escaped, but one thing is certain. I'm the only one who survived. The case is still unsolved. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And if anyone finds the village or the cult, run. Because every 30 years they need new victims. And next time it could be you. The fog. It never goes away. The coastal town where I grew up had always been quiet, peaceful, even a little monotonous. But in the last few months, something was wrong. The number of disappearances had increased considerably. Childhood friends, acquaintances, even strangers. And curiously, no one seemed to care. The authorities were silent, as if the town had become accustomed to it. But I couldn't just sit still. Something told me there was something much more sinister going on. I decided to investigate on my own. What intrigued me the most was the fact that all the victims, without exception, had passed by a place before disappearing. An isolated house by the beach, known to everyone as the refuge, It didn't make sense. No one knew who owned the house or even why it was there, but there had always been whispered stories about the place. Stories that said it wasn't just any house. At first, I thought it was just superstition. But then, after speaking with some older residents, I discovered something disturbing. A woman, frightened and trembling, told me a story. She didn't want to speak, but she knew I was determined to understand what was happening. She told me that more than 50 years ago, the house was invaded by a cult. A cult that attracted people who were looking for refuge. Vulnerable, desperate people, seeking answers or a safe place. They believed that by welcoming these people, they were performing a sacred ritual. However, after taking in these lost souls, they were never seen again. They disappeared, as if swallowed by the house itself. The cult, however, remained intact. It kept welcoming those who arrived, with promises of peace and salvation. The young woman inside me, who had always believed in mysteries and unsolved stories, couldn't ignore that. What was happening there wasn't an accident. Those disappearances, the people who were lost, everything led to that house. The refuge, I had to see it with my own eyes. That night, without telling anyone, I went to the house. The strong wind cut through my skin as I walked along the deserted beach, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks echoing in my ears. When I reached the house, a strange feeling overcame me. The house seemed to be watching, as if it were alive. The dusty windows revealed nothing, but I knew something, or someone, was inside. I decided to enter. The door creaked, echoing in the stillness of the night. The smell of mold and old wood filled my nostrils. Each step I took seemed heavier than the last. Inside, everything felt strange. There were no furniture, but the walls were covered with strange and worn symbols. I felt a presence, a dense energy in the air, something that didn't make sense. And then I heard something, whispers, from inside the walls. And it was at that moment that I realized I wasn't alone. I was being watched. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the shadows. The victims, the missing people, were there. They were waiting. In the corner of the room, a figure appeared. A pale man with empty eyes, who looked at me as if he recognized me. He whispered to me that the cult wanted me. They wanted me to become part of the refuge. I asked, stunned, what he meant by that, and he replied, "They welcome us. And then, they keep us here." Before I could question him further, he stepped away, and I saw him join others. Each of them seemed to be someone I knew. They were there, trapped, waiting for another soul to complete the ritual. They were alive, but they couldn't leave, and I finally understood the true nature of that house. When I turned to leave, the cult appeared. They weren't there to hurt me, but to seduce me. They wanted me to stay. They wanted me to become one of them, another soul welcomed by the refuge. I ran to the door, but it was locked. I was trapped, and the only thing left was to surrender to what they expected. The house, it calls to me still. I don't know how I escaped, but I know I am no longer the same. The refuge is waiting, and when the tide rises, it always calls. The cult doesn't forget its victims. They wait. They always wait. And if you ever go to the beach and the wind feels stronger, if the waves sound like whispers, beware. The refuge may be waiting for you too. It was on a quiet night, like any other, that things began to change. I was home alone, resting after a normal day, when the first phone ring broke the silence. It was an unknown number, and curiosity led me to answer. "Hello?" What I heard on the other side was a strange sound, as if the person was trying to hide their voice, distorting it on purpose. But even so, I could make out a few words. "She is missing. Everyone will disappear." The call was abruptly cut off with no explanation. At first, I thought it was just a prank, someone trying to scare me. But then, the calls started coming more frequently, each time from different numbers. And with each new call, a more distorted and hoarse voice, laden with a subtle malice, would tell me details about people who had disappeared in my town. People I knew, close friends. Mariana was last seen at the central square. Just before she disappeared, the voice said on the second call. Carlos was using the same app as you. The name Carlos made my heart race. He was my coworker, someone I used to go out to lunch with. What was going on? How did that voice know about Carlos? And the strangest thing, how did it know about the app one was using? This call tracking app was relatively new. Created to help locate missing people, it allowed anyone who was concerned about someone to track the phone numbers of people using the service. I and several others in the town used it, as our town wasn't exactly safe. But what was happening was not normal. The victims mentioned in the calls, they were all using the same tracking app. I wondered if I would be next. Fear began to creep in, a sensation that no longer left me in peace. That's when I decided to investigate. At work, I began discreetly asking about the people mentioned in the calls. No one knew anything, but the feeling that something was wrong only grew. I decided to check my own app, as if I might find a clue that others hadn't noticed. What I found was even more disturbing. In the app's history, there was a record of tracking all the victims. And in each of those tracks, there was something in common. The location of each disappearance was marked in one single spot. An isolated house on the outskirts of the town, a house I knew no one had lived in for years, a house that, until that moment, I considered just a local legend. The voice on the other end of the line kept tormenting me, telling me I shouldn't go any further, that I would be the next target. But I had no choice. A part of me needed to understand what was happening, to know what was hiding behind those calls. On the night I decided to go to the house, everything seemed perfect for a horror movie. The town was in an eerie silence, as if everyone knew something was about to happen. I drove to the location marked on the app, feeling a growing tension in the air. The house, old and decaying, seemed to be watching me with its empty windows. I entered the house, my heart pounding in my chest, and it was there, in what seemed to be an old office, that I found an old phone box. And on top of the box, a name, The Collector. That was enough for me to understand everything. The call tracking app wasn't just a tool for location. It was being manipulated by someone who used the technology to track the victims, not to save them. The Collector was the one making the calls, the one feeding off the fear. Each disappearance was linked to his macabre game. Before I could run away, the phone in the box rang. I didn't answer, but the familiar voice on the other side of the line began to speak. You should have stopped, you shouldn't have come. Now you will be the last. I felt a presence behind me, a shadow watching me. I looked back, but saw nothing. However, I knew who was behind all of this. It was someone much closer to me than I ever imagined. I never heard the voice on the phone again, but every time I answer a call from an unknown number, the feeling of being watched never leaves me. And now I know the Collector is still out there, and he's waiting to find the next victim. I'm one of the few people who survived him. But if you use that app, know that it may be too late when you realize what's really going on. The Collector never gives up. And who knows, you may be the next one to get the call.